Evening, everybody, and welcome to our April lecture. Before I hand over to Joanna, our director, to introduce our speaker, we have some business, both workaday, everyday business, and some more pleasurable business. The workaday business is an announcement that some of you may have heard that we've had a problem with our venue for Leicester, but amazingly, our fantastic organiser, Kate, has found a new venue. So do not worry, the conference will go ahead, and it sounds as though it's going to be even better. So she's going to show you the map.
Okay, the new venue is going to be St Martin's Conference Centre, which is more or less in the middle of Leicester, and it's just by the cathedral. You will not be able to miss it. And actually, it's much more suitable than College Court in lots of ways, because it will be near all the walks, it will be near the Guildhall where we're having a reception, and Leicester is awash with hotels. But I will be sending out an email, or updating what's on the website, and for those who've already booked, I'll be sending out an email with recommendations. There is, opposite the St Martin's Conference Centre, there is some rooms available, but at the moment there's only enough rooms for the conference organisers, but there might be other rooms. There might be some other rooms released in this place later, but for the moment, don't bother to try and book there because you won't be able to. That's it. So everyone should be delighted because it's going ahead. And if anyone wants a map, there's some maps there.
So we're very grateful to Kate, and it sounds as though she's really plucked triumph from what could have been disaster. So thank you so much, Kate. The other thing she wanted to announce is, please, if you know any students, encourage them to apply for the student scholarships. We have a number of scholarships. At the moment, we haven't got enough applicants. So if you know any students, it does look like it's going to be a fantastic conference. Please encourage them to come. We'd now like to move on to the more pleasurable aspect of the introductory matter, which is to present the Reginald Taylor Lord Fletcher Medal. Our speaker this evening is this by 2 years winner of this medal, which is offered on a biennial basis to the best unpublished essay by an emerging scholar. And we're delighted that Joanna has won this and is now going to come and talk to us. So here is the medal, if you'd like to come to the front, Joanna. So I will say a little bit more about Reginald Taylor at the beginning of our party afterwards, but he was a secretary of the association, and he and his sister, he died as secretary, and his sister wanted to support young scholars. So this is what the award is for. So Joanna, congratulations. Here's your medal. After the conference, we have the party, the April party, so I'm delighted that everyone can come and join us for a drink afterwards. Now I'd like to hand over to Joanna.
Hello, everyone. It's a really, really great pleasure to introduce to you tonight this evening's speaker, Professor Joanna Olchawa, from the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. Joanna received this prestigious professorship in Munich in 2024 and joined the department in October last year, and came to Munich from the Goethe University in Frankfurt. She's got a really impressive list of publications to date, but most relevant to this lecture, and probably the way that she might be known to many of you, is her book on Aquamanila, which was published in Regensburg in 2019. And I also wanted to point out to you that she also contributed quite significantly to the Hildesheim exhibition catalog, Islam in Europa. And many of us that were at the Hildesheim Romanesque conference were able to go and see that exhibition, where you were able to see the kind of juxtaposition of Aquamanilia from Europe and Aquamanilia from the Middle East. Her current research is on sonic dimensions of medieval art, and it focuses on pulpits around 1500. And this is a part of her habilitation. And as Alex already pointed out, Joanna's lecture tonight evolved from her paper on the Püsterich of Sondershausen, which she won the Reginald Taylor and Lord Fletcher Essay Prize for, and which was actually published last year in our journal. But I think she's got a few more things to say about it tonight. So thank you for coming tonight, and we're really excited to hear what you've got to say.
Thank you so much. Especially thank you for the kind introduction and the invitation here to speak in this such distinguished setting. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed members of the British Archaeological Association and dear colleagues, it is a real great pleasure to share with you some thoughts on what may be the most unappealing bronze objects of the Middle Ages, at least at first glance. And yet, it is precisely its visual oddity, its not obvious function, and the rich history of intellectual inquiry it has sparked that make the so-called Püsterich of Sondershausen such a remarkable object. But before I begin, I would like to say that I am really deeply honored to have been awarded the Reginald Taylor and Lord Fletcher Essay Prize for the article I wrote on this enigmatic bronze. My sincerest thanks go to the committee, to the British Archaeological Association, and in particular to Dr. John Munns, who guided the essay through to publication in the Journal of the British Archaeological Association with both great patience and insightful suggestions. So thank you very much. Since the article was published last autumn, I have received wonderful and encouraging responses from around the world, and I have decided to continue developing the topic further. I am currently preparing a new research project on epistemic objects and medieval automata, which will also connect with a more recent work I have undertaken on sonic dimensions of medieval art, sound art history or something like that. But that is, as they say, a topic for another day. So let me now return to the original fascination with the Püsterich of Sondershausen, fascination not with beauty or refinement, certainly, but with an object so curious, so confounding, that it has puzzled scholars for nearly 5 centuries. I would like to start with a brief personal note of context. My doctoral research focused on aquamanilia in Islamic ceremonies and Christian liturgy. These are vessels used for hand washing, while my postdoctoral work turned to the complex bronze artifacts produced in the 13th century Hildesheim in today's Lower Saxony. For years, really, I was concerned with formally and technically sophisticated and visually compelling objects such as this dragon in Hamburg or the baptismal font in Hildesheim, or other masterpieces such as the broad from ear to ear grinning lion aquamanile, which is preserved in your very own collection here in London in the Victoria and Albert Museum. Amidst all these extraordinary works, this bronze appeared particularly odd to me. First, its sheer size and materiality are arresting. Standing over 22 inches tall and with more than 77 pounds, roughly the weight of a grown Labrador or a harp, concert harp in a case, something like that, it possesses an undeniable physical presence. But while its sheer dimensions impress, its execution does not. Despite having been cast in one single piece using the complex and quite risky direct lost wax method, the workmanship is strikingly crude, and yet it haunted me. The object in question, commonly referred to as the Püsterich, was unearthed in the 1540s by the then owner of Rothenburg Castle in the Kyffhäuser region in Thuringia, right in the middle of today's Germany. The precise circumstances of its discovery remain unclear, but several contemporary sources mention an underground chapel, though details are scarce. Initially labeled a curious antiquarian piece, ein merkwürdiges Stück des Altertums, the object soon evolved into something far more intellectually compelling, a riddle, or indeed a scholarly provocation. When we take a historiographical view, we find that over the centuries, no fewer than 80 writers, including metallurgists, antiquarians, preachers, archaeological, art historians, have attempted to determine first what purpose it might once have served, and second, what it represents. For the first question, interpretation have ranged widely from a steam device, Dampfapparat, or a signal for fire alarms, Feuersignal, to a vessel for chemical experiments, a distillation apparatus, a brandy burner, why not, and a baptismal font stand or fountain figure. Iconographically, too, speculations have been no less inventive. The object has been read as a guardian of Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, the Thuringian idol Püsterich, a Germanic, Lower Saxon or Slavic idol, as for or even a fertility symbol. Martin Friedrich Rabe, a 19th century architect and historian, was the first one who famously compiled the majority of these interpretations already in 1852, not without a certain irony. He recognized in the Püsterich an object so overburdened with meaning that it became meaningless. And yet he himself could not resist the fascination and created further interpretation of its own. It is precisely here where the challenge lies. To return our gaze to the object itself rather than to theories that surround it. For when an object becomes the stage for too many projections, it risks vanishing beneath them. So let us, for a moment, set aside forget about baptismal fonts or fire signals, and consider the Püsterich for what it materially is before we turn to the two most crucial and pressing questions already mentioned. What was its function? And in terms of iconography, who or what is this figure meant to represent? We begin with the object itself, laid out on the examination table, white gloves at the ready. So today, the Püsterich resides in the Castle Museum of Sondershausen, just under 20 kilometers from the site of its discovery. It takes the form of a nude male figure in a squatting position. One hand rests on his knee, the other is raised to his forehead in a gesture that might be interpreted as a lookout pose. The man's body is strikingly rotund, with chests, shoulder blades, and belly vividly articulated in bold, exaggerated relief. A narrow fluted belt encircles the waist, while the arms are formed in the round and held slightly apart from the torso, an additional technical challenge that required careful wax modeling and venting during casting. Despite the stylization of the body, the head is treated with surprising delicacy, relatively. The hairstyle is distinctive, with forehead fringes and smooth, defined strands that curl into one single lock at the nape of the neck. The facial features are more elaborate. Thick, arched eyebrows converge over a short, flat nose. Large oval eyes with bulging lids lend the expression strangely alert. The cheeks are notably descendant, the mouth pursed in a gesture that unmistakably suggests puffing. This emphasis is further underlined by the round opening placed directly at the center of the lips. A second hole is positioned at the top of the head. Neither of these apertures is necessary for the casting process. Unlike the two rectangular windows on the upper back of the head and the right side of the torso. Those were functional. They were used to remove the clay core from within the hollow figure after the casting process and were later sealed. So by contrast, the two round holes most likely relate to the object's function, reinforcing the interpretation of the figure as a vessel. And yet, our perception of the object today is shaped by its current state of preservation. The surface of the bronze is porous, visibly blackened, likely from exposure to intense heat during experiments, probably in the early modern period. A suspension loop at the lower back was inserted at a later date. Also, parts of the figures are missing. The feet, along with the entire left forearm and the wrist. The loss of a forearm in particular has a really interesting documented history. In 1591, Elector Moritz of Hessen-Kassel decided, without bothering to ask the owner's permission, to have the arm cut off in order to test the composition of the bronze. Zweifelsfrei probieren das Erz, as contemporary sources put it. One might call it early modern curiosity. The details of that examination are not known, but almost 2 centuries later, the severed arm would prove unexpectedly useful. It enabled Martin Heinrich Klapproth, one of the founding fathers of modern archaeometallurgy, to conduct one of the earliest successful material analysis on a historical artifact. We know since then that the alloy is composed of 91.6% copper, 7.5% tin, and 0.9% lead. So, in a way, the Püsterich gave arm to science and holds, because of that, a rather special place in the history of scientific engagement with objects, at once victim and pioneer of material analysis. Remarkably, despite over 4 centuries of scholarship, the question of its place of production has rarely been given the focused attention it deserves. Often, scholars settled too quickly for a broad dating somewhere between the 10th or 15th centuries, most commonly placing it in the 13th century and locating its production vaguely within the Harz region where it has been found. Martin Friedrich Rabe, whom I already mentioned for his critical compilation of interpretation, was among the first to introduce a comparative dimension. He drew a formal parallel between the Püsterich and the bronze baptismal font of Hildesheim Cathedral, cast around 1225. He pointed specifically to the 4 half-kneeling figures supporting the basin, representing the personifications of the 4 rivers of paradise. However, his interest was less in the dating than in advancing an understanding of the figure as a support for a baptismal font. Contemporary art historical analysis allow us to move beyond such broad associations. From a formal perspective, kneeling figures with one leg bent are not uncommon to in medieval repertoire. They appear, for example, in small-scale candlesticks, although these are always clothed and never depicted with a hand raised to the head. A more compelling line of comparison can be drawn with aquamanilia, so these ritual vessels for hand washing. One kneeling figure in Nuremberg in particular shares several characteristics: a bulbous torso, disproportionately large head, and unusually thin limbs. The head of a Püsterich, rendered with striking detail, invites yet another layer of comparison. Features such as the bulging eyes under heavy brows and the distinctive hairstyle are mirrored in the centaur-shaped aquamanile and on the lid of the Hildesheim baptismal font. And of course, even an example in the Wyvern collection here in London, featuring an opening in the mouth and interpreted as a half-blower, further confirms the existence of a shared visual language and also a functional typology. All of these works were produced between 1220 and 1250, most of them directly in Hildesheim. At that time, the city was not only a religious and artistic center, but also one of the foremost hubs of bronze production in medieval Europe. Its proximity to the rich copper mines of the Harz, the intellectual vitality of its cathedral school, and its participation in expansive trade networks created ideal conditions for the emergence of such highly specialized metalwork. We may therefore reasonably conclude that the Püsterich was created either in Hildesheim itself or in a workshop closely connected to it, sometime during the decades between 1220 and 1250. This attribution is crucial as it situated the object within a specific artistic and intellectual milieu, one in which experimental forms, unusual iconographies, and scientific thinking intersected with advanced metallurgical practice. But the Püsterich is not unique in Europe. Especially here in London, but also more broadly across England, we find several comparable bronze figures, many of them quite strikingly as archaeological finds. In England, the discovery of two such objects fueled antiquarian and archaeological curiosity. One unearthed at Basingstoke in 1799, and the other at Emmington Hall near Tamworth in 1830. The Basingstoke figure, here in the collection of the Society of Antiquaries in London, shows striking similarities in its overall form. It features opening in both mouth and neck, cheeks swollen in a blowing gesture, and it is otherwise nude, with the genitals clearly articulated. Certain decorative details, such as the brooch on the throat and the belt at the belly, may have been later additions. The second figure from Emmington Hall, and now preserved in Reading Museum, is often referred to as the Henley blower. It too shows a kneeling position and one hand raised to the head, and like the former, it features two openings, once again suggesting a function as a vessel. Prior to these finds, such figural bronze were already known in England. The most prominent examples is the Jack of Hilton, a hollow one-pieced bronze of a kneeling youth now housed in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. What makes this one special, however, is its secondary ritual use. For centuries, it was owned by the Vernon family at Hilton Hall in Staffordshire, where it played an active role in the early readjustment of tenancies. Each year, around Christmas, tenants were required to bring a goose to Hilton Hall and lead it, draped it with 3 cloves of garlic, 3 times around the fireplace of a great hall, in which stood, quote, an ancient statue, image, instrument, or heirloom of brass, of a fashion, proportion, and likeness of a boy, commonly called Jack of Hilton, which every year in the Christmas time was accustomed to be placed in the hall of a manor house at Hilton aforesaid. This sort of action is not attested for other objects of this type. Certainly unrelated to its original function, Jack has been reframed, repurposed, ritually reinscribed. Beyond the British Isles, further examples are known. In 1813, a similar figure was excavated near Novomoskovsk, near Moscow, although it is now lost. 2 further half-blowers are preserved in Basel and Vienna, though their provenance only extends back to the 19th century. These 2 are notable for another reason. They depict female figures as indicated by stylized breast and nipples. The Basel figure is especially intriguing. It wears a crown inscribed with the words Stephanus Lagerensis me fecit, the only known example in the corpus with a surviving maker's signature. The place mentioned, Lagarina, lies near Verona in northern Italy. Since Verona is home to the older plates of the famous bronze doors of San Zeno, dating to around 1130, earlier scholars attempted to link the Basel and Vienna figures to that stylistically varied ensemble, proposing accordingly a similar date in the 1130s. However, such comparisons are no longer tenable. Also, the stylistic affinities to all the other bronze are far too vague, and in fact, the Vienna object, though once similarly attributed, diverge significantly. A seated figure with bent legs, more refined facial features, and little else in common with a Püsterich beyond a raised hand. So, where does that leave us? From a strictly formal or stylistic point of view, it remains difficult to define a coherent group among the 8 known examples from England, Germany, Russia, Switzerland, and Austria. And only the Püsterich of Sondershausen can be confidently attributed in terms of both production, site, and period. Moreover, these all are mobile objects. Their discovery locations do not necessarily correspond to where they have been made. And yet, despite this dispersal and disparity, there is something that unites them. Each figure features 2 small openings, usually one in the mouth and another one on the crown, head, or neck. Paired with puffed cheeks and blowing gestures, these apertures unmistakably declare their purpose. These were vessels intended to perform. So let us turn to the question of function. As early as 1721, the theologian and historian Johann Georg Leukfeld emphasized that any serious attempt to understand the Püsterich must include an analysis of function. A fair point, but what kind of function are we speaking of? This question should open on 2 levels. First, the practical use of the vessel, how it operated, what it did, and second, its intellectual or symbolic purpose. What might have justified the curious decision to cast a naked, puff-cheeked figure in bronze, complete with holes in its head? Regarding the practical side, scholars have proposed various hypotheses. As we already heard, these range from a fire signals to distillation vessel and so on. Yet the most enduring and indeed the earliest explanation comes from the antiquarian and metallurgist Georg Fabricius. Writing in 1561, he was also the first one to describe the object after discovering it and the first to name it. He coined the name Püsterich, drawing attention to its swollen cheeks, derived from the German pusten, meaning to puff, and proposed it was kind of a steam-powered device. His suggestion was disarmingly vivid. If filled with water, sealed and placed in fire, the resulting pressure would cause the vessel to expel its contents, quote, like flames over the bystanders with a great roar. This proposal may have been inspired by a motif appearing in several copies of the Belli Fortis, a military technical manual composed already around 1402 by Konrad Kaiser. In the 1360 Frankfurt manuscript, we encounter the image of a naked youth with flames erupting from his mouth. In some versions, the accompanying text reads in translation, I am Philoneus, made of copper, silver, bronze, clay, gold, and other sturdy stuff, and when I am empty, I do not burn, but set my body filled with turpentine or with strong wine on the hearth. When warmed, I emit fiery sparks with which you may light a candle. Although the technical details are optimistic and rather inaccurate, since silver and gold are unsuitable materials for fire, the principle was understood. The figure was a humorous automaton embedded within a military and experimental context. Fabricius' theory would later receive modern confirmation from the engineer and historian Franz Maria Feldhaus, writing in the early 20th century. He apparently took great pleasure tracing the idea back to Albertus Magnus in the 13th century. In his De Meteora, drawing in ancient sources such as Aristotle's Meteorologica and its Latin translations, Albertus described a vessel shaped like a man designed to emit steam. He writes, take a solid earthen, bronze, vessel provided with an opening at the top and bottom and standing on feet. Fill it with water and place it near the fire. The steam is then generated in the vessel and steadily increases in proportion to the head of the fire until, escaping with violence through one of the openings, it shoots the water far off on the surrounding objects. If it escapes through the bottom of the vessel, it discharges sparks, burning coal, and hot ashes to a considerable distance. This sort of vessel is usually called soufflator, or a blower, and is ordinarily shaped like a man who is blowing. Albertus, for his part, likely drew inspiration from Vitruvius, whose De Architectura contains a description of a bronze aerolopile, a vessel filled with water and heated to emit a blast of wind. And here I would like to mention it is entirely plausible that the De Architectura of Vitruvius was available to Albertus Magnus via the library of St. Michael Abbey in Hildesheim, where a Carolingian manuscript of the text is known to have existed. And given Albertus' own presence in Hildesheim, it is tempting to imagine that he encountered the text firsthand. Vitruvius, in turn, inherited this model from ancient pneumatic and hydraulic experiments, above all from Ctesibius, Archimedes, and Philo of Byzantium, but most famously, Hero of Alexandria in the 1st century AD described a aeolopile in its most iconic form, a hollow sphere that rotated when steam exited through bent nozzles. But he also imagined other forms with figures and heads that puffed air to fan coals. What we see here is not merely a series of technical curiosities, but the long and evolving tradition of pneumatic experimentation transmitted across ancient, Islamic, and medieval contexts. Regarding its function, it can be added that the Püsterich of Sondershausen is indeed fully operational, though one might say it's hardly suitable for practical use. Several attempts to activate the vessel have been recorded, and their results were, shall we say, less than encouraging. During one of such experiments in the early 17th century, the kitchen of the castle in Sondershausen almost burned down. Since then, prudence and concerns about security only permitted experiments outdoors. The most recent among these was in 1801, when the object was filled with brandy, phosphorus, sulfur, and iron filings, as still evidenced by its dark, charred surface. Why this particular mixture was used instead of just water is impossible to reconstruct today. For his part, Feldhaus suspected that the shape of the kneeling figure would have tended to produce little steam, with only a small portion of its surface being exposed to the heat. Amid many descriptions of the objects operational during experiments, in some cases it is documented that the Püsterich simply fell over, the water flying out of the interior and extinguishing the underlying coals. So much for practicability, but then again, practicality was never the point. In this sense, these objects are neither machines in any modern sense, nor artworks alone, but demonstrative instruments, multisensorial, performative, and deeply didactic, in short, epistemic objects or Wissensobjekte. They are meant to generate knowledge. And yet, despite all this ingenuity, there remains one vexing issue. While thinkers like Fabricius in the 16th century and Feldhaus in the 20th century have offered persuasive accounts of the function of the Püsterich, its iconography have remained curiously opaque. In other words, even if we know how it worked, we still don't know what it meant and why a naked man was the ideal candidate for the job. Despite centuries of attempts to explain the form and the motif of the Püsterich, and naturally all the other half-blowers across Europe, much of the interpretive effort has remained speculative. One particularly creative strand of etymological argumentation transformed Fabricius' coined term Püstericius into a supposed Germanic god Püstericus or Püsterich or something like that, a name that is circulated widely on broadsheets and in antiquarian discourse. And also you can see in the background a really functional Püsterich with. Others suggest more familiar figure, as already mentioned, a protective idol of Frederick Barbarossa or four. More productive, however, have been the archaeological studies, particularly those focusing on the English finds. These turn to visual comparanda from antiquity, especially images of distorted naked male figures interpreted as misshapen dwarfs. It was the English antiquarian Walter Leo Hildburg whose 1951 essay remains the most substantial contribution to the study of half-blowers, unknowingly touched one of the key sources when he referenced pygmy in Pliny the Elder's Naturalis Historia, written in the 1st century AD. And marginally, just to state the obvious, I would like to emphasize that in the context of this historical study, I will continue to use the Latin term pygmy in order to signal a critical distance from the colonial frameworks and terminologies of the 19th and 20th century. So, in this Naturalis Historia, Pliny describes distant peoples, dark-skinned, malformed, with exaggerated physical features, and explains their shape as a result of being formed near fire. He writes, "The whole people was called Epherian, then Atlantean, and finally Ethiopian, after Ethiops, Vulcan's son. Little wonder that freakish likeness of humans and animals are born around its furthest edges, since the liveness of fire is the creator that forms their bodies and molds their shapes. It is definitely claimed that in the interior of the eastern part there are peoples without noses, the whole of their face bring perfectly flat, while others have no upper lip, others no tongues. According to certain reports, there is a pygmy people in the marsh where Nile rises. However, where we left off on the coast, there is a chain of mountains which glows red as if on fire." To modern ears, such descriptions are troubling, both in their exotizing tone and their conflation of physical difference with geographical otherness. But in a historical perspective and in the context of a Püsterich, they are surprisingly illuminating, because the pygmy were not obscure. They were widely known in classical literature, from Homer's Iliad to Aristotle's Historia Animalium to Ovid's Metamorphoses. They consistently appear as small, ugly, strong, dark-skinned, naked creatures with large genitals, living in the hot southern parts of the world, dwelling in caves and famously at war with cranes. But most importantly, they are defined by what they lack, namely decency, reason, and civilization. A remarkable example of this imagery has survived in a 5th century BC Rhyton, a different kind of vessel, now in Erlangen in Germany. It is shaped as a pygmaeus carrying a dead crane, crouching with one leg forward, a pose uncannily similar to that of a Püsterich and the other half-blowers. This brings us to a larger and, I believe, essential question. Why does this ancient motif become topical again around 1220 to 1250? Why this new renewed fascination with the pygmy, now no longer in pottery or mosaics, but cast in bronze? Once again, Albertus Magnus offers the key. In his monumental 28-volume encyclopedia based on Aristotle's zoology, translated from Arabic into Latin, Albertus places the pygmy firmly within the context of natural observation. But what is most striking is this. Albertus does not concern himself with whether pygmy are real or imaginary. He just assumes their existence and uses them as a conceptual tool to explore the nature of the human. He uses them not to frighten or to moralize, but to think with. In doing so, he naturalizes the myth, removes it from the realm of demonology or allegory, and asks, What qualities are specifically human? What distinguishes human beings, not in appearance, but in essence, from animals? This is groundbreaking and in many ways a radical shift in perspective. It marks the beginning of what we might now call philosophical anthropology. Albertus focuses, if we look closer, on three aspects: appearance, behavior, and cognition. The pygmy, he writes, are bipedal cave dwellers with nipples and immobile ears, physically close to humans. But mentally, they differ. They are savage, without reason, without shame, without justice. They are not capable of judgment or of contributing to civic life. And so, he concludes, they are only similitudinous homines, imperfect imitations of humankind. In his own words, quote, the Pygmaeus then, according to the things already introduced, it is midway between the human, who has a divine intellect, and the other mute animals, in whom nothing of a divine light is perceived to exist, insofar as it uses experiential cognition through a shadow of reason, which it alone of the other animals receives. Because pygmy do not possess an intellectual intellect that enables them to compare facts or to comprehend generalities, they cannot understand the principles of art or science. Indeed, he writes, a human participates in sense capable of instruction in every respect, and in memory, experience, reason, science, and art. The Pygmaeus, however, participates in sense capable of instruction, memory, a little of experience, and nothing of reason, science, and art. The capacity to engage with both art and science thus constitutes the most important feature distinguishing humans from pygmy. In this light, the Püsterich of Sondershausen and the comparable works are not just vessels for steam. It becomes apparent that Albertus' ideas about the pygmy are reflected in these objects in a truly striking way. The nude figures are clearly defined with clearly defined genitals, and in the case of the female half-blowers, also with accentuated breasts, visually assert their lack of shame, a quality Albertus explicitly denies them. Their shapes, deliberately rough and ungainly, seem to exaggerate their ugliness, again a characteristic attributed to pygmy. Yet this roughness stands in contrast to the precious medium of bronze and the technical sophistication of the lost wax casting process. So these figures are not simply crude, they are carefully made to look crude. Their ugliness is intentional and it is crafted with skill. The puffed cheeks, long associated in medieval sources with indecency, not only point to their function as air blowers, but also serve to intensify this sense of comic or grotesque deformity. Even the raised hand, forming a lookout gesture, may be read as an allusion to the crane battle described in classical texts. And here lies the true paradox. According to Albertus, pygmy do not comprehend art and science, yet these objects are clearly created by humans who do. This gap, that tension between what is depicted and who created it, is precisely what makes the iconography so compelling. More generally, the notion of a pygmy mediating a position between humans and animals is central for understanding the Püsterich and all the other bronze. Hardly any other motif embodies such a constant shifting among states. The object is created from a material that is initially liquid and then takes a solid form after casting in a process whereby wax is replaced by bronze. Its function transforms water into steam, letting it escape, moving from the inside to the outside with a loud screech. Therefore, form and motif, materiality and function are closely entangled here. These figures were designed both in terms of their function and their iconography to astonish, to entertain, and above all to stimulate intellectual reflection. In this sense, they recall the ancient automata, pneumatic or hydraulic or mechanical devices that seemed to defy the laws of nature. In antiquity, such devices were frequently used in the context of private settings, particularly in so-called symposia, where they served as catalysts for conversation, inviting thoughts about the mechanism and techniques involved. This dual function of delight and instruction is central to understand these objects. We know from literary and technical traditions that automata were described in the works of the Banu Musa brothers in the 9th century Baghdad, or in Al-Jazari's Book of Knowledge of ingenious devices around 1206, and with a European perspective in Villard Donacourt 13th century sketchbook. While the survival of actual automata from these periods is rare, we can point to certain preserved examples. Among them, there are the sounding griffin of Pisa or the Marischal lion. They are both hollow inside and quite huge, except for a small bowl-like cavity in the rear. As Anna Contadini has proposed, these cavities may have produced a roaring sound when wind entered through the open beak or through some pipes. Such works reflect the multisensory ambitions of medieval engineering developed in regions shaped by Islamic rule and culture. Seen in this light, the Püsterich and the other half-blowers emerge not as isolated curiosities, but as a surprising and important link in the history of automata, specifically within the western parts of Central Europe during the 13th century. From this time and place, no other comparable devices are known to survive, since antiquity. And so, they stand as rare examples of a revival of ancient hydraulic traditions, recontextualized with a new intellectual and artistic environment. Regardless of the specific tradition to which they belong, these automata have in common one aspect, their multisensory experientiality. They are not merely objects to be seen. They can be heard, touched, even smelled, thanks to the occasional addition of sulfur, wine, and other pungent substances. The sensory richness was often deployed to impress and even intimidate the user or the audience as a subtle form of soft power, legitimizing authority through wonder. But such objects could also serve a pedagogical purpose and facilitate learning. Medieval thinkers understood well that stimulating as many senses as possible enhanced memory and cognitive retention. And in this respect, the Püsterich of Sondershausen is remarkably effective. Its significance lies therefore in its role as an epistemic object, as a Wissensobjekt. And if you allowed me to underscore the obvious, perhaps unnecessarily given the expertise gathered here in this room, by Wissensobjekt I mean an object that is not merely a passive bearer of meaning, but an active instrument of inquiry. It is deliberately designed and used to generate knowledge, to prompt understanding and to stimulate reflection. The fact that all these bronze half-blowers, often strikingly similar in design, appear across regions as diverse as England, Germany, Switzerland, and Austria, suggests that we are not dealing with isolated inventions. Rather, we are witnessing a broader phenomenon, one concerned with questions of physics and technology, of nature and transformation, and of philosophical anthropology. And this, in turn, points to the more durable, more embodied, and ultimately more profound form of learning, one that emerges not solely from text and images, but from matter and form, from sound and touch. At the center of this intellectual constellation stands Albertus Magnus, a Magister Regens at the University of Paris, the thinker who brought Aristotle's scientific worldview into dialogue with Christian theology. For Albertus, the search for truth lay in both faith and knowledge, and crucially, this knowledge was not confined to books. It included animals, plants, minerals, tools, and indeed, even strange bronze figures. In short, objects like the Püsterich are not marginal to the intellectual culture of the 13th century. They are its very expression. As a final reflection, allow me to look beyond Albertus Magnus and the High Middle Ages, because what has occupied me throughout this investigation was not only what the Püsterich meant then, but also why it is difficult to understand the object today. How did the knowledge surrounded such epistemic object disappear, not just in the case of the Püsterich, but across the wider corpus of half-blowers and automata, which have been reduced to purely technological curiosities? It seems that its original meaning of a Püsterich began to fade in the early modern period. Albertus' authority diminished, and the Pygmei were increasingly dismissed as fiction. This marks a crucial shift, not just in intellectual history, but in the perceptibility of objects like the Püsterich. To be more concrete, after its rediscovery in the 1540s, the Püsterich continued use as a soufflator was documented, but the iconographic framework that once shaped its form had quietly eroded. This may be due to the fact that by the 16th and 17th centuries, most scholars understood Pygmei as mere fabulae and as evidence of Homeric misinterpretation. The philosophical stakes that Albertus Magnus once attached to the creatures between human and animal no longer seemed viable for advancing knowledge. Classical and medieval texts were increasingly seen to as insufficient foundations for epistemological progress, and with that, Albertus lost his authority. In 1605, for instance, the Italian philosopher Giovanni Talentoni expressed this change in no uncertain terms. He wrote, "What could be more absurd than to say, as Albertus did, that they, the Pygmei, are humans on the one hand and beasts on the other? Is there perhaps a middle ground between human and non-human?" And yet, even as their meaning faded, the form of such half-blowers endured. From the 15th century onward, new examples were produced, though their shape changed. Full-bodied figures gave way to heads and busts. One such piece, here around the corner in the British Museum, shows the head of a black man with richly detailed garments, visually distancing itself from the wild Pygmei of earlier tradition. It is only after the link, the Pygmei, was lost, that the Püsterich become the canvas for new attributions, reimagined as a protector of Barbarossa, a regional idol, a fertility figure, and so on. And that too is part of its story. In conclusion, what makes the bronze Püsterich of Sondershausen so extraordinary is, above all, the intellectual complexity embedded in its simple, stylized form. Created between 1220 and 1250, it offered an occasion to engage with one of the central philosophical questions of its time: what distinguishes the human from the animal? This question, explored by Albertus Magnus, is here translated into bronze. The Püsterich materialized in its way that were both humorous and philosophically profound. Yet this bronze object is more than just a catalyzer of philosophical thought. Its significance lies in the tight intertwining of form, function, material, production technique, and iconography. None of these aspects stands in isolation. Rather, they reinforce and illuminate one another. It is precisely this entanglement that makes the Püsterich such a rich subject of inquiry. But the idea behind it traveled so far, resulting in related objects in England, Russia, Austria, and Switzerland, suggests a resonance that went well beyond a local workshop. But to fully grasp its meaning, we must understand it as a Wissensobjekt, an object of knowledge. It was designed to take part in scientific and philosophical discourses of its time, to provoke complex anthropological questions. It did not merely show something, it made its viewer experience a concept through material, heat, sound, and image. Because it appealed to the full range of the senses, it allowed for a different kind of knowledge, one that was embodied, memorable, and quite literally striking. Amidst such a sensory onslaught, one could not escape the object nor the questions it raised. This was the case during the Middle Ages as well as after the object's rediscovery in the 16th century, and it remains true today as we return to objects as site of knowledge. So thank you very much for your attention.
So thank you very much for Joanna for that really fascinating and elegant paper. You happy to take questions?
Of course, yeah.
So, does anybody have any questions? Martin?
Really, it's 2 points, but this is really very convincing. But one of the things about the Püsterich is that he's got his cheeks puffed out. And that takes me back to the story of the satyrs, and particularly the story of Marsyas, because the Auloi were invented by Athena, but she saw her reflection in the water and threw them away, and the pipes were picked up. So it's also these semi-wild figures. The other thing is something I think I've perhaps pointed out before, which is one of my favourite objects in the British Museum. It's at the end of the Roman room, though it may well be a bit later. It may be Byzantine, maybe in a circus. I think it comes from Alexandria. But it's a goose, and it was heated up, and it made a whistling sound from the water. And where this comes in is that you've pointed out, of course, things from the East, but in a sense, between the East and the West was all this time was the Byzantine Empire, which went in for these things, including rising thrones and things like that. So is there a Byzantine and East Roman, later medieval Roman or Byzantine element in all of this?
Thank you so much for all your thoughts. I have an haven't thought about a Byzantine, but I should. Yeah, especially with a reference to the goose. I thought it's a fountain figure, but maybe it's more into that. So I need to take a closer look. Definitely. So thank you.
Thank you very much. That was completely fascinating. I enjoyed every second of that talk. I had two questions, if I may. First, you hinted at this, but could you say a little bit about the kinds of context where you think these objects would be used? Do you imagine them in a court setting, in a university, if it becomes Albertus? Where would these be used, do you imagine? And the second, could you say something more about that interesting geographical distribution and the fact that it doesn't apparently include the Mediterranean, Italy, Spain? Why might it be that these objects are not there, or is it just that they're not recognized as being there? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, I was really interested in the context, but I haven't found anything. So I only can imagine an intellectual surrounding environment like the university, of course, in Paris where Albertus Magnus was, or in Cologne or something like that. But I haven't found anything about it. So if you have any ideas, I would be very happy about it. But nothing in this kind. And concerning the second question, I started to look closer to it. So this was like the beginning in my thinking about automata and so weird and so strange objects. And I think there is a lot to discover. But still, I am at the beginning with this topic in a broader sense, of course. Yeah.
Yes, thanks again. That was really fantastic. I wanted to know if tests have been done on the materials of your other examples to locate where the bronze was made and where the objects were made.
Not yet. Well, we have the alloy composition of Klaproth, but it's been a while since then. And I'm in contact with the Schloss Museum in Sondershausen to maybe to test the bronze, not to touch the object, of course. So, but there are so many very innovative methods in, examine the alloy, the copper alloy of this bronze and all the others. So yes, I'm thinking about it, and I'm in contact with the museum to do so, because I think it might be very interesting, and also to look inside. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for a wonderfully stimulating and thought-provoking paper. I enjoyed it very much. You raised a number of very interesting issues, which were all very serious. I wonder whether there's something more to be said about the sort of humorous side of this, hilaritas, the whole question of fools. And I couldn't help think, looking at this, the first other figure I thought of, given its pot-bellied appearance, is Morgante, the dwarf in the Renaissance, of course, who looks rather like this, 15th, 16th century. Mm-hmm. And, of course, he does look like a figure of fun in the way he is portrayed. And I also thought, rather irreverently, that, of course, one of the attributes of fools, both in the Middle Ages and having seen the exhibition in the Louvre in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, was their extraordinary ability to fart flatulence sort of almost to order. And I wonder whether this was sort of almost part of that sort of crudity, of that sort of amusement in blowing out air, to surprising people, and some people who were not familiar with what these things could do. And this goes back to what Tom was saying about the the circumstances and the environment in which they might have been shown. Do you have anything to say about that? I mean, I know it's a little bit less serious than the philosophical side you were expounding, but I think it may well have a relevance for some of the pieces at least.
Thank you so much. Absolutely. But it's so difficult to trace back humor. And so I'm not quite sure how to do that. Well, of course, we can speculate about it. But when I turn to the historical sources, I see very serious attempts, not the humor, but I can't exclude it, of course. So the spectacle of having such a bronze functioning and doing something against the laws of nature, of course. So it must have been an impression. But maybe I have to look more closely to the humor in all these objects. But it's very hard to find something.
Thank you very much indeed. That was a wonderful paper. Just picking up on this, just the last. It made me think about images of people playing bagpipes and again sort of distended cheeks and that sort of humor in manuscripts. But also the whole thing of automata is very interesting in the 13th century and reminded me of the automata that I think Matilda of Artois, Mao of Artois, has in her garden at Edin, doesn't she? She has all these sort of, they're birds in cages and things, and do people get squirted with water as they go round? I think they do, and that's in the very early 14th century. I think Viardoncourt is possibly, reading that, links with Vegetius, but also possibly some of those things, as you suggest, look like the insides of machines to amuse automata. And the other one that it makes me think of is, again, you're looking at 13th century, when William of Rubruk gets to Karakorum, he finds this great silver tree made by William of the Great Bridge in Paris, who's been captured by the Mongols, but has made this enormous silver tree, which is a fountain, and it's got sound, doesn't it? It has angels blowing trumpets, and it's to do with hydraulics and somebody who stands in the middle of the great silver tree and makes it work. And these are just odd examples, but it suggests that there's a much more of this going on than we think. And I'm talking through my hat here, but my colleague at Reading, Françoise Lesseau, was very interested in automata in romances, and that's something that I can't talk about at all, but that may be something to think about here as well.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for all the references. And I was also concerned with the mediality. So I have a lot of literal sources, written texts, and I have depictions. But I really don't have the objects. And I'm really interested in the object, not in the description, and this semi-fictional, sometimes description of automata, where I don't know if it's a real description, like a technical description, or is it just like imagining something. So, and this is like a really a specific type of literature, the description of automata. It's something between, or it's both at the same time. So the literal sources are great, but I was just focusing on the objects and what kind of objects can I find which may be part of this automata things and this context. So yeah, but I need to dig deeper into that topic. But yeah, thank you very much.
If nobody else has any questions, I think we've all found this a really stimulating, fascinating paper. So thank you very, very much, Joanna. And now for those who've booked to come to the April Welcome to Spring party, please go through and help yourself to a drink.